So I'd like to introduce Martin Check, who has been with Microsoft for 12 years and Azure for the last 4, if I remember your spiel correctly. And similar to what Garrett just shared about how Facebook does production improvement reviews, or SEV reviews in their case, Martin's going to talk about the Microsoft version.
Thank you, Kurt. All right, thank you, Kurt. Actually, one clarification. There's a question here about how you actually drive the follow-ups after the production review or the post-mortem from Gareth. I'll be talking about that process and what we've done to help make sure that's durable and effective. So it's actually hopefully quite complementary to Gareth's talk. So production improvement review at Microsoft was actually created to solve some of the very challenges we've seen with service availability and reliability. When we started through this process, we saw there were a subset of services with high incident rates. We're going through a lot of growth in Azure and across Microsoft, and the services had varying degrees of maturity. Some were highly developed, they've been running for years, kind of brownfield services, as you've heard in some of the other talks, and some were brand new with DevOps teams that were just getting started. The response models similarly were inconsistent, and even through the review process, there were competing priorities. The bugs were logged, they may or may not have known what to do, and there was just so much work to do to improve. It was hard to see which investments were the most important ones to do to ensure future reliability improvements. So to answer that, we came up with the production improvement review. So what is a production improvement review? How does it work? The goal of this forum really was to get centered on a common set of metrics to drive improvements, and then set a cadence to which we could drive actions and surface insights. It's one of the first tenets of this, that we had to be really engineering focused. We didn't want execs. We didn't want folks who were going to kind of talk about all the great things in the world. We wanted the actual engineers who were going to be there, discuss what they had, what they needed, share insights across teams, and then figure out how to take action in the near term to make things better. Not in the next planning cycle, not in the next year, not in the next re-architecture, but how do we take near-term action to improve? We wanted to be metrics-driven, so we could measure both real-time and long-term the impact of the changes we've taken, and not let people just make change for the sake of making change, but we could actually set a hypothesis, take an action, then measure if that was actually the right action, and if it moved the metrics. And if it didn't, we could fail fast and iterate again. We wanted to use agreed upon common KPIs that were aligned to our top level objectives. If you're at the keynote, you heard Greg talk about these kind of tensor metrics a little bit. Eliminate human touches, improve availability, reliability, or the common parlance of error budget, and ship at a high velocity. And so we'll talk a little bit later about the virtuous cycle. That's kind of a running theme. It's a really valuable tool. But that's how we could help measure the right KPIs were there. And getting agreement upon the KPIs, having everyone working in the same KPIs is a pretty important part of that. I kind of mentioned a little of this earlier, action-oriented. We wanted to make sure that we didn't just meet and talk and talk and talk and talk, but we would leave every meeting, every discussion, and every review we'd check in on the actions. If we didn't have action, we'd determine new ones, and we'd have owners of those actions come in and talk about challenges they've had. This is not the sole forum we had, but we actually built this into an entire funnel, a continuous cadence of meetings that would last beyond just we sit here and we talk, but once we bootstrap the production improvement review, it lived beyond the actual forum and create a rhythm and a cadence that was durable. So, the first step of the PIR was aligning the virtuous cycle. Now, outside of the SRE community, the virtuous cycle isn't necessarily so widely known, so this required some socialization. The key part of the virtuous cycle for us, and you've seen, I think Gareth had a 3-cycle version of this, Greg showed a 6-box version of this. The exact number of boxes is not so important, but what was really important was for each aspect of the virtuous cycle, we determined some KPIs that we could use to measure how we're doing, and these help us determine what those tensor metrics are. You can see up here in deployment, your code goes out. You can see how quickly you ship your code, how old your builds are, what your target build age is. I'm sure you have your own set that you use. Within the monitoring part of the cycle, you can look at your detection times. We called that TTD, or time to detect. How many incidents were detected by automated monitoring versus other. I'll leave that as an ambiguous bucket. I'm sure you've got your various others. The improvement cycle, the RCA, the postmortem, how complete and effective your RCAs are. There's some interesting metrics I'll talk about a little later. Time to mitigate, how quickly you're actually fixing, diagnosing, mitigating your outages. Even the term mitigation is a highly loaded term that required a fair bit of negotiating to get to a common place with every team. And of course, probably the most important part for any engineering team, any service, is your code. Probably some of the more challenging pieces to measure. But through the PIR, the incident life cycle, the virtuous cycle, probably our most important one was repair debt. Are you burning down the repairs you booked as part of your incidents? So I kind of alluded to this earlier. It wasn't enough to write down the metric names or even to assert what they were and then move forward. There's actually a fair bit of variability in terms of what metrics teams use or what they defined as authoritative or what they thought a particular name even meant within the same set of metric names. And so I have here the framework we developed. Hopefully this looks familiar to a lot of you, or these terms are at least roughly similar. The exact thresholds and points and names aren't as important as much as it is that within your own group, you agree on what these are and how they are and what you measure. Of course, time to mitigate is, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. We measure this from when the SLA was breached or when your service left optimal state until the full cycle of your fully restored. Service is back to normal. There is no SLA or SLO breach, and your service is operating optimally. Within this, we broke it down to 3 sections. And there's a lot of kind of important checkpoints in here that I don't have listed but are interesting to measure. They don't quite fit in the cycle, things like diagnostic time. But I'll walk you through each of these briefly. Time to detect. This one actually is one of the most important, from when your SLA is breached until when you've actually got within your incident tracking system, visible to your incident responders, whoever those are, engineers, operators, DRIs as we called them, that the failure is visible to them. This is actually probably one of the more controversial metrics, because when do you start time to detect? Is it when the alert is intended to be thrown? Let's say maybe you wait for 5 minutes for self-healing to fire. Is it start time when your failure started or when you determined that you should alert on the failure? And you can imagine a bunch of other different variances on this. Even from when the detect happens, is it when someone sees the alert or is it when it can be seen? So we happen to land on the failure start, the very first possible measurable version of that failure until the incidents in the ticketing system. You may land somewhere else, and there's always negotiation around that for edge cases. But the 90% case, is the most important. And that's really when you start digging too much into the edge cases. It's good to bring it back to what's the 90%, and you tend to get a lot more consensus around that versus working around every possible thing that could go wrong or fall outside of that. Time to engage, measured from the incidents detected in the tracking system until you have the right engineer engaged. And again, you can imagine where you end up with some variability here. Is it the first person you call? Is it measured from, some teams even measure time to engage from the very start, the first failure. So you can see here we've actually drawn boxes for this lens to help people align the same metrics. And if you measure TTE as from detect and someone else measures it from SLA breach, you're going to have some very confusing conversations about why one team's taking longer and other team's going quicker. And the last phase of the cycle, time to fix. The time that it takes from when you have the right engineer engaged until you've got mitigation. And again, even mitigation definition has a ton of variability within it. Some teams measured mitigation by fully restoring everything back to the default state. Some teams just said, hey, if I get it from a Sev 1 to a Sev 2, I think everyone here uses Sevs or some version of that, then that's mitigation. Or maybe Sev 2 to a Sev 3 or Sev 1 to a Sev 4. But really mitigation we measured is when you've got the service back to SLAs are met, error rate is back to normal levels, and you're recovered. We don't consider mitigation to include, let's say you failed out. If you fail out, you reduce the SLA breach or the impact, that's mitigation. This is kind of important to measure mitigation there because fail back could be a long time, and you really want to incent failover, rollback, quick twitch restoration mechanisms as a way to end an incident so folks don't get into debug camp. Talk about that a little bit later. So again, you may end up with different definitions. The important thing is that you have a common taxonomy that's agreed upon. So now we have metrics defined. That's just one set of metrics. You can imagine you go through whatever part of the virtuous cycle and you have to have these conversations, maybe start one at a time. The next step is building dashboards. And you really want to make sure that now that you have these metrics, you've got common definitions, you make sure they're measurable, you audit the definitions, you put them into dashboards where everyone can go see them at any given time, and you can use it to run the entire rhythm of business and all your meeting cadences. So this is just one example. You can see here we've got each of the time to detect, engage, fix, mitigate goals measured. We have the goals set along the side, and then you measure them by period, weekly, monthly, daily, whatever the right cadence is. And you can quickly see trends. You can see if you're getting better, getting worse. You can use this to compare against the improvements you've done. It's really important that you have these key metrics to drive the virtuous cycle, track how you're progressing. You can derive the insights, and then you create action plans against areas where you're not hitting the goals. You might also notice here a few additional lines. If you go to the eye chart, you're not intended to really look at this, but within metrics like time to engage, you'll have surrogate metrics. These are pretty big categories of work. Time to detect has a bunch of subcategories of reasons you could miss detection or have long detection. Time to engage has similarly, we start to develop surrogate metrics. These are metrics below the metrics or sub-metrics to help us say, okay, let's break down time to engage into why it would take a long time to get the right person. Is it because it takes you a long time to call each individual? Maybe the person, guy or gal's not answering the phone. Maybe you have to call 2 or 3 people before someone picks up. Maybe it's that you call, each person answers quickly, but you have to call 3 or 4 people. You call the first person, they say, oh yeah, not me. That's just, an alert. Or, yeah, I see that, but then there's this layer of the stack beneath me. You need to invest in diagnostics and layered monitoring and other debugging tools, and maybe even better monitoring. If the top layer of your stack's alerting and the layer beneath isn't, then you want to make sure everyone has their appropriate alerts. So you can imagine a bunch of different surrogate metrics. I'm not going to cover them all. You'll probably have to discover yours. But once you identify those surrogate metrics, surfacing them, making sure they're automated, measured, you can bring them here, helps you drive more precise insights and see why you may or may not be trending towards your goals. And you also might notice here, there's a little bit of X's. Apologies for the X's. But we measured for some percentiles. If you don't have a lot of incidents, maybe you have 10, 20 incidents a month, it's kind of hard to take a small data set and really draw a meaningful conclusion against it. So if you either have high variability or small data sets, your data set's sparse, large outliers, you could apply a 70th, 90th, 95th percentile depending upon your precision, and then help normalize the data a little bit. And really, you want to really drive towards as much of 100 percentile as you can within reason. And then if you do apply this percentile, you want to make sure you look at the outliers. In fact, some of the best insights we had came from those very outliers. Is, sure, maybe 50, 60, 70, 80% of the time things go well, but it's that 10%, the 1%ers maybe as you call them, that really cause you the trouble. So you want to make sure you don't exclude those, but you can normalize your trends a little bit on that. So really the important thing here, for each set of the virtuous cycle, you start with your high-level concept. How long does it take to make an incident? And then you drill down into narrower and narrower slices of the response process, into narrower and narrower views of each KPI. And you become increasingly precise in terms of where to make investments. So the next layer, I heard some questions earlier for Gareth's talk. Do you create bugs? Do you track your bugs? Probably the most important part of the production improvement review is consuming the output of the root cause analysis. So Gareth talked at length about a good RCA process. Blameless RCA, absolutely. Ask the 5 whys. You want to really get to the real root cause, not just the surface root cause. Make sure you have the right people there. Share the learning beyond just the individual or teams involved. I can't tell you how many times we've had an RCA review and one person said, I do this, and someone else said, oh yeah, me too. Oh, wow. We all really need to relook at this and and maybe have more systemic repair than just fix this individual bug. I won't talk in depth about the RCA process. There's actually a couple more talks that go into great detail about postmortems, post-implementation reviews, RCAs, whatever you might call them. The important part for PIR is that every time we had a bug, an improvement, we'd log it and make sure it's tracked as part of the production improvement review. This is really important because you can take your operational debt and you can engineer it right into your development process, just like feature work. And then you can compare it against your live site metrics, response metrics, and error budgets or availability metrics, and you can see where do you need to invest. You may decide to do features versus operational or live site work, but you can really help inform that conversation based on these repair trends, and you know exactly which work needs to be done. It's right here in your queue, sitting right next to your engineering work, your feature work. And so you can take these examples. Service 1 right here, you have your green and gray bars representing added and removed bugs as teams are creating new repairs and closing them out. And then your gray line, probably a common chart, hopefully for some of you, which represents your cumulative debt. You really want to see that gray line remain stable or decrease. If you're really doing a healthy RCA process, it'll never drop fully to 0. And so you can see service 1, we started the improvement process. The repairs started to get added and the backlog grew. And the team really built the repair process into their standard engineering cadence, and it started to come back down. And that's a pretty healthy trend. And then as long as it stays at some reasonable level to be determined and your error budget's on track, that's a good line. Service 2 here, you can see we bootstrap. They looked at the debt, they got it, it spiked, and then they pulled it under control, and then it started to increase again. So this is really a good signal for where the team needs to invest. In the triage meetings, they should be looking at this repair debt and helps inform, wow, we need to go prioritize this against future work. We need to make sure we have, maybe they are already and they're falling behind, maybe we need to prioritize entirely investments or even slow down the deployment velocity to get this under control until everything's normalized again. Again, that can be a bit of a catch-22, so I won't go into detail about how exactly you move every particular metric, but at least you can have more data to drive and inform those decisions. And then, of course, each team has to decide how they're going to address it themselves. So take your repair debt, together with live site metrics, you expect to see improvements in availability, in response times, and incident metrics as the repair debt came under control. And generally, that was the case. However, for some service, we noticed even though these repair debt charts looked healthy, the reliability and the live site metrics weren't necessarily getting better. So for these services, we had to look a little deeper. Why aren't they improving? Why aren't the services improving if the metrics we were tracking, the improvement in repair metrics, seemed to be trending correctly? We had to do a little bit of investigation on this. We looked at incident reviews, reviewed logs, other data we collected, talked to the teams, and we identified some additional metrics that helped us provide insight into why repair debt might not correlate to service improvement. We did have to hand curate a bit of data, but once we understood which metrics mattered, we could then instrument and automate this data and bring visibility within these same dashboards to which additional metrics we could use to help services get better. And this surfaced a key anti-pattern for the RCA and post-RCA process. If a service isn't as thorough with its RCA, maybe the RCAs aren't getting completed on time and the repair debt's never getting logged. Or maybe they're doing the RCA, but they're not really getting through the 5 whys. Or even they're getting through the 5 whys, but they're only answering some of the questions there, or they're asking the wrong 5 whys. The RCA process is a bit of an art. And new teams, busy teams burdened with ship cycles may not be getting to the right level of thoroughness. So once we understood how this anti-pattern interrupted the virtuous cycle, we could measure the thoroughness of the RCA and actually create some data that tells us how good is the RCA, how thorough is it, and then we could actually correspond. Let's say an incident didn't meet the time to detect goal. We could then go measure this in the automated systems and then see, was a detect repair filed? Some of this required adding some additional taxonomy to the repair process. It's not just a repair is a repair is a repair, but repairs can be attributed to detect or engage or diagnose. It actually helped us go make sure that a full set of repairs were getting logged. Are you doing test repairs if something gets missed in testing? Are you doing prevention repairs, engagement, detection, diagnosis? You can imagine the whole gamut. And so all these missed repair items started to add up. And it let us create this idea of virtual debt. You can see the example here. Your gray line is pretty stable. This is your standard repair debt, similar to what you saw in the previous slide. It looks like everything's just humming along fine. Then you start to add up the corpus of missed repairs, missed RCAs, or incomplete repairs. You see this dotted red line appear, which is virtual debt. Kind of looks like a PacMan if you draw it on some charts. The virtual debt represents a corpus of repairs that were never logged and are going to start hurting the service down the road, kind of the dark matter of the RCA process. In fact, when you start to see this, and we looked back, we could see that where there's virtual debt accumulating, some of the same detect, mitigate, prevention repairs were getting repeated in multiple outages until they're eventually logged and fixed. So this is really important. The worst thing you could have is not just an outage, but the same outage or the same miss happening repeatedly. So, coming around to Cadences, we wanted to make sure the PIR wasn't just some one-time Herculean effort where we lift everything up, bootstrap it, and then as soon as we walk away, it all collapses. We wanted to have momentum. and be more of a holistic way to operate services than a meeting or a dashboard. Data insights alone aren't enough if no one sees them. Although PIR, the Production Improvement Review, started as a monthly meeting with service owners, we found it really worked best when supported by a framework of weekly live-site meetings, daily triage meetings, RCA conversations, and really it turns into a funnel. The top of the funnel are the triage meetings within each component. Think of them like scrums, whatever your normal engineering cadence is. Then those turn into weekly service reviews, RCA conversations, whatever the cadence you have, the next layer up from that, each service has to have its own cadence of reviews, metric reviews, live site reviews, RCA reviews. And these can feed into cross-service reviews at the weekly level. And then at the monthly level, you really get this nice roll-up. If you're in the monthly meetings the first time you're looking at data or seeing something, you're probably doing something wrong. It really should just be a summary of what you've done throughout the month, what actions happened in the weeklies and daily triages, and how you're driving those improvements. This is a little tricky at first because you can run into meeting fatigue. It's not something where we bring in just a brand new meeting and everyone has to go to a whole new set of meetings. We've really got to snap into whatever those existing cadences are. And if there's not a cadence, it doesn't matter whether there's a meeting or an email or a scrum or just an offline dashboard review. As long as you see the outputs and the actions surfacing in the weeklies and monthlies, the right things are happening within each team. So, what insights did we get from this? It's not an exhaustive list, but I thought these are some of the more interesting ones I'd share. The first one is around monitoring. And I mentioned earlier, you look at monitoring and detection gaps, but really, if you have a monitoring gap and you're waiting a week or a month to go fix it, that's much too long. You really want to plug that hole right there during the incident. And usually monitoring should just be a threshold adjustment. Maybe you instrument something new. If it's not an entirely new set of hooks in service. We found good success with just tagging those directly into the incidents. Make sure folks don't drop off an incident call until they've got that fixed. Sometimes that's too hard, but at least take an effort at it. And really, we have different sets of metrics. It varies by service, but it's not unusual to see 10 or 15 times longer mitigation times if monitoring doesn't detect an incident. And it's not just the missed detection time or the manual detection. And so you're now scurrying around and digging through different layers of the stack to say, okay, so we've got some problem, but where did it start and what is it? And of course, dashboards and diagnostics help here, but your best and first gate is your monitoring. Next is, don't get in a debug camp, especially with DevOps team. You've got engineers, they're passionate about code. Everyone loves to go crack open the code and get a debugger and attach it to an instance. But if you're doing that real time on a call, you're doing something wrong. Your best levers are roll back, if you know it's a change, fail over, if you can, and whatever other quick mitigation levers you have, apply them here and try not to get out the debugger. Through the repair process through the RCAs, you may hear a little more about this today, but right size your repair. Don't create repairs that are too small or too big. You want the Goldilocks repair size here. We saw people create these really large repairs. Hey, I'm going to go rewrite this application, and then I'm going to go, solve world hunger, and then everything's going to be perfect, and we'll be, in 4 years we'll be great. Yeah, great, but whoops. You guys are all wondering what the heck's going on. I'm reading the next slide. We'll come back to this one. So, right size your repair. Try and find the quick version of the repair. If it was too large, try and get to the quick one. Make sure that If you can't do it in a week or 2 weeks, it's probably not a repair. It's probably more of an engineering backlog item that needs to go into your operational backlog. We actually created a whole backlog that we run alongside the product backlog that could capture these large items. Whenever you do planning, weekly, monthly, yearly, I don't know, but whenever you do your planning, you can look at this backlog and if you're not hitting your error budgets, you're trying to figure out what the right work to do is, you've got it right there waiting for you, and you can prioritize it and triage it periodically, make sure you have the right stuff at the top. But this helps the other tensor is, don't make your repairs too small. So if you do create a small repair, you're doing the right thing. You'll fix this point bug. You figure out the exact bug and which line of code caused the problem. But what's the pattern? How do you make sure these bugs don't crop up? Do you have the right unit testing? You have good code coverage? Do you have a good review process? Whatever it is. Is the service brittle and susceptible to a single code push causing global problems? Make sure that gets backlogged. If you want to get a good balance of short-term quick fixes and backlog items to help improve service resiliency and cross-service themes that may show up for larger conversations. And taxonomy is important. Human error is never human error. If you find yourself in an RCA conversation, it's like, if only he didn't push that button, if only he knew not to use a semicolon, then you're doing something wrong. And that can go back to any different layers of, rollout gates, canaries, monitoring, test gaps, BVTs, whatever it may be. Failover, resilience, auto rollback. There's a whole laundry list of repairs you could add before you'd go to human error. And DRI was a term we used to refer to engineers, the on-call engineers. And when we looked at the engagement data, we noticed there were these super DRIs. And this is interesting. So we're looking at, hey, who tends to join the calls? Who's taking a long time to get on, or why does it take a couple of people to get to the right person to resolve? And you guys might have some news on your team. It's like, oh, this is broken. Call Bob. Call Jane. It's like, why do you have to call Jane? Why does the on-call for the team not know this? And so these folks were exponentially more engaged when we're looking at how many people are joining which calls than your average on-call engineer. And this, of course, represents all kinds of anti-patterns, and it's natural, right? You want to build SMEs, but these are single points of failure. What if they go on vacation? How many people have been in a bridge and there's the person who's there, it's like, oh yeah, I'm in Bermuda, I don't have internet access, but I'll walk you through it. That's a great example of your super DRI at work. And you want to make sure you get that knowledge distributed, improve your playbooks, do trainings, brown bags, but look out for that. So, I'll hop back a slide. Just touching on this briefly, we talked about the dashboards. An important layer is not just showing your monthly dashboard, but you want to have real-time dashboards that are accessible to everyone in every service. And so you may look at have these giant aggregate metrics that look great for your execs, your VPs, or your service directors, but it's really more important that you have this data viewable down to the dev managers, dev leads, the individual service owners, and even the individual engineers in the service. They can see what they can do today to make the service better. I want to see what's in my backlog of future work, and then right alongside that, I want to see what are my incidents, repairs, and other items, post-mortems that I need to work on so I can help prioritize. And of course, hopefully, the live site work is snapping to the top, just like a bug, just like an incident. It should be there's an interrupt. So you can pivot the same view, start from the service, come down, pivot by manager, individual, component, whatever other layer, however you might want to see it, to have it there, and then to have the feedback real time. When I change something, if I go fix a bug or change something, get that feedback real time, this turned green. That feels good. A little bit of cultural engineering there. So I got my 3-minute warning. That gives us a little bit of time for Q&A. Folks have questions, there's the 2 microphones up here. Really, if you get nothing else out of this, I want you guys think about your RCA process, your lifecycle process, something you can engineer, just like feature work. It lives there right alongside the feature backlog. Thank you.
You have, with all these bugs, repair work you log, how much analysis do you do to find duplicates or the same thing occurring in multiple services?
Ooh, that's a good question. So, within a service, we actually tend to do a good job about not having duplicates because the bugs are actually created by the service owners. There's no central, here's your bug, go deal with it, but each team has a good idea of what they need to do and how they need to do it. And you can actually tag hit counts as a bug shows up in multiple incidents. Across services, that's a much more difficult problem to attach data to and automate. Because what one team calls, add client-side rate limiting, another team might call throttling, another team might call, stop blowing up. And so the best way we found to surface those was through the cross-service reviews. And so, of course, you can't take every incident for every team and share it across the whole org. But we tried to take the really interesting, notable ones where we thought there was particular learnings or anti-patterns that would surface and share them at these cross-service reviews that happen weekly and monthly. And it was pretty often that we'd see the same themes pop up. But I don't think we ever solved the problem of how we'd get one bug across many teams. Every team would go have to figure out on its own how to go solve a problem, unless there was something that SRE or some central engineering team put in place to help every team. It'd be more like, okay, I go learn this, I'm going to go put it in my backlog and figure out how to do it.
Thank you.